And finally, we are joined by Dr. Thomas Duthy, the Executive Director of Invex Therapeutics with the ticker code IXC. To tell us more about their repurposing of approved drug, Exenatide, I will hand you over to Tom.
Thanks, Jane. If I could have the first slide, please, that would be great.
Let me bring it up for you.
Thanks very much, Jane. We can go to slide 2, which holds the important disclaimer information for today's presentation. So Invex is a clinical stage drug development company with an express focus on an orphan disease called Idiopathic Intracranial Hypertension, or IIH. We are taking an existing drug known as Exenatide and repurposing this drug as a trademark and proprietary formulation called Presendin to treat this disease. We are in phase 3. We require a single phase 3 study for market approvals in the UK, Europe, and Australia, which I'll come to. We have orphan drug designation in both the US and Europe for this particular indication with Exenatide, Presendin. The addressable market is large and growing, which we calculate at 1.6 billion annually. I draw your attention to our capital structure. We have a very strong balance sheet that will see a phase 3 program the phase 3 program fully funded through to market approvals. And our enterprise value relative to that opportunity is reasonably skinny at 13 million. Our major shareholders there, you can see directors and management hold 17%, our top 20, 58%. And our board is extremely well credentialed in both drug development and expressly within the area of idiopathic intracranial hypertension. Professor Alex Sinclair, who's a co-founder with Dr. Loveridge, she is the world's leading expert in idiopathic intracranial hypertension. And Megan Baldwin, who joined our board last year, some of you may be familiar with her. She is the current CEO of Opthea Limited. Before I tell you about the disease in more details, I'd like to share with you the opportunities as we see it here at Invex. So I've mentioned the TAM, but if you slice and dice that TAM to focus on where our nearer term product registrations lie in Europe and the United Kingdom, that represents about $1 billion annually in addressable market. Perhaps unlike other drug development companies, investors will see from time to time, this is a completely unencumbered drug therapy market for Presendin. There are no approved treatments for IIH. There are no new treatments in clinical trials with the exception of ourselves, who are targeting patient recruitment late this half for our phase 3 trial. So really there is an urgent market need for new therapies. And from a drug intervention perspective, this is a chronically administered drug as proposed. Without the drug, the patients will very quickly relapse with their disease symptoms, which I'll come to on the next slide. Supporting clinical data. So we have phase 2 data that provided us a very confident and clear statistical signal and a clinical evidence of efficacy in that population that bodes well, we believe, for our phase 3 program. There's no significant safety concerns either over the 12 weeks of treatment. That's not unexpected, given that the drug we're repurposing, Exenatide, has been approved for type 2 diabetes for many years and been in many millions of patients. So we're somewhat unconcerned about any deleterious safety issues here, but we are innately focused on ensuring that we design this phase 3 trial expressly to meet the primary and key secondary endpoints to support a market registration. We've built a very strong sets of very strong barriers to entry for competition, not least of which is our orphan drug designation in the US and Europe, which provides 7 and 10 years market exclusivity respectively. That's the first barrier. The second barrier is we have issued patents for the use of Exenatide in IIH and other pressure-related disorders of the brain in both the United States, Europe, and Japan. And these patents extend out through 2035, and that's without Hatch-Waxman patent extensions. Most of you, I'm sure, have not heard about this disease, idiopathic intracranial hypertension. So this slide really just summarizes how important this disease is, albeit it is a rare disease. So the disease manifests effectively as a dysregulation of cerebral spinal fluid secretion in the brain of patients, and that leads to increased intracranial pressure or brain pressure. So think of it a little like expanding a balloon in a glass jar. The balloon being filled with cerebral spinal fluid, and the jar clearly is the skeleton. These patients do typically manifest as women of childbearing age who have obesity. There's no known cause, hence idiopathic, and the incidence, which is increasing, is around 4.7 persons per 100,000 population. 90% of these patients suffer headaches that are progressively more severe and frequent, hence the glass jar balloon analogy. This is a major cause of patient morbidity, and up to 25% of patients can suffer permanent vision loss as a reflection of the increased pressure and the compression effects of that pressure on the optic nerve. The impact is large and growing. These patients have a very poor quality of life, repeat hospital administration, and the only tools at the disposal of clinicians at the moment are invasive neurosurgical procedures that seek to lower the intracranial pressure by virtue of a shunt at the back of the head to drain the fluid, or in the case of the optic nerve, to fenestrate the optic nerve itself, that is to sort of relieve pressure on that. And both of which have 50% failure rates. They're not an ideal course of intervention, hence the need to develop new and effective drug treatments. The solution is well based in strong science, developed by Professor Sinclair, who I mentioned on our board. It's a very, I'll just tell you, Exenatide is what's called a GLP-1 receptor agonist, and the link between GLP-1 receptor agonist and IH was formed and forged by Alex Sinclair, and that's where the bulk of our intellectual property lies, and also our orphan drug designations. And so we're effectively repurposing or taking this existing drug and conducting clinical trials to support a registration in a new indication, which is IH. And we, in our phase 2, we were the first to show that a GLP-1 receptor agonist, being Exenatide, was able to show safety and efficacy in an IH population. I won't go into too much detail on the TAM and how we cut the TAM, but what investors should note here is that albeit there's a small number of patients, only 60% of these patients are diagnosed. Interestingly, we would expect the diagnostic rate to increase over time, commensurate with the development of clinical diagnostic criteria in 2015 and a set of rule books on how to treat this disease, both of which were written by Alex Sinclair and colleagues in 2018. So that bodes well for perhaps more awareness and more diagnostic or a higher diagnostic rate. These patients will have long-term commitment to drug therapy. 4.5 years, give or take, is the duration as referenced in the clinical literature. But really the market drivers here are quite substantial, and this disease is expected to show annual growth of 3.4% per annum, which is driven by increasing obesity, as I mentioned, increased awareness. And we note that even a small 10% increase in the diagnostic rate of this disease is an additional 300 million in TAM for this particular indication. The critical components for us, I've bucketed here as really 4 things. There's the manufacturing piece. Can you make the drug? Can you make it cost effectively? Can you scale the drug? And are the costs of goods commercially viable? We'll come to that. The second piece is the clinical piece. Can we show, by way of a registration-directed clinical trial, that this drug, Presendin, is efficacious in the disease, IH? Regulatory. Do we or can we receive regulatory clearances to not only commence the study, but do we and can we receive regulatory clearances for approval of the drug upon clinical success? These are key ingredients. And finally, the funding piece. So we have 31.4 million cash in the bank. The funding we have is consistent with our ability to complete and register this drug in IH. The partnership we have is with a Korean company called Peptron, which we signed in September 2021. This is a very strategic relationship with Peptron. They have significant expertise in long-acting peptide formulations, expressly Exenatide. And this really, for us, de-risked our clinical and commercial development for Presendin, because we are able to leverage reams of preclinical and clinical data held by Peptron to submit with our clinical information as part of a dossier for regulatory clearances to commence the trial. That is a material saving in time and cost, which we previously estimated to be $3 million over 12 months. The financial implications, I think, are even stronger for Invex and its shareholders. We are purchasing once a week Presendin from Peptron at a fixed price per dose for clinical and commercial sales. There are no royalties. There are no milestone payments tied to future sales. Their manufacturing is present by way of a 16,000 square metre GMP facility in Korea for this Exenatide formulation we are using. Interestingly, that would support around 12,000 patient doses per month, which equates to over 200 million Australian dollars in gross sales if we were to simply price the Presendin asset at the reference price for the existing drug called Byetta, which is the Exenatide formulation in type 2 diabetes, which I mentioned. So as a baseline assumption, we have an ability to manufacture already at scale, and we have a relationship that allows for capacity expansion in the future should the need arise. And as I mentioned, this is a once-a-week formulation. For those of you who love consult diagrams and clinical information, here you go. This is the phase 3 trial study design. So this is a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, multi-center clinical trial to determine the safety and efficacy of Presendin in IH. We are looking to establish up to 37 centers across Europe, the UK, Australia, and the US, 240 patients, 24 months recruitment. The primary endpoint is a change in intracranial pressure at baseline and at 24 weeks. So a very simple lowering of pressure at 24 weeks versus the baseline is how we've powered the primary endpoint. The key secondary endpoints are all related to the clinical manifestations of this disease, noting headache and vision. We also are clearly needing to look at safety. As I mentioned, we feel safety will be okay. We are looking at the production of anti-drug antibodies, as this is a peptide agent. Importantly, we are also establishing quality of life measures, which are important for those payer discussions for reimbursement upon regulatory and clinical success. As I mentioned, this study is designed to meet the requirements for approval in the UK, Europe, and Australia. We are including centres in the United States, and the reason we're doing that is to help us with informed discussion with the US FDA. I'll come to this in a moment, but essentially we elected to pursue a European strategy first and foremost, principally because the two regulators differed in how they thought about a registration-directed trial for Presendin, and the board, in very significant consultation, which took a number of months with clinical and regulatory advisors, was that this design, as we put forward to investors, is the lower risk, more strategic pathway. And clearly the results will be very useful for us to determine the next steps with the US FDA. But with $1 billion in TAM in opportunity for us in Europe, we believe this is absolutely the right strategy for shareholders. I've mentioned the regulatory strategy, Europe, Australia, and the United Kingdom through the MHRA. As I said, the study is designed to inform the FDA and to help us work with the FDA on how they think about a registration for IH at a later date. And it's important to note that we were tireless in our pursuit of trying to harmonise a single phase 3 study, noting that most drug development companies, investors will see if they're not orphan, they typically require 2 pivotal phase 3 trials. This is just one trial. We were unable to sort of harmonise into one global study, but that's okay. Just in summary, and our outlook, single phase 3 trial, $1 billion in unencumbered addressable TAM. We think there's scope for the rapid incorporation of Presendin into IH treatment guidelines, which were developed initially in 2018 by Alex Sinclair and colleagues. The reason I say that with some level of confidence is those same treatment guidelines have no first-line new drug treatment as an approved standard. So typically in drug development, guidelines are followed somewhat assiduously by clinicians, and your incorporation there as a treatment intervention does lend itself to adoption and does lend itself to payer coverage. I mentioned we have that economic evaluation, which helps drive our reimbursement strategies at a later date. Our US centres are going to be progressively enrolled and established, and that bodes well for our FDA work. This is potentially the first and only approved IH drug, and we're fully funded to complete this trial through to registration. And I note that our corporate overhead, which excludes the non-cash share-based payments and our R&D, which is directed to this phase 3 trial, is around 1 million annualized as a 31 December run rate. So we are not spending shareholders' money unnecessarily on corporate overhead. We are directing it to the study. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Jane. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much for that, Tom. Great presentation. There's been quite a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to jump into them. So could you please elaborate on why there are no competing drugs either approved or under trial?
Yeah, for sure. So there is a number of off-label type drugs, one of which is called acetazolamide, which has been around for 50 years, although a large meta-analysis through the Cochrane database established that that drug, albeit does get some use in IH, it's not effective and lacks the evidence. I think part of the problem has been the lack of diagnostic criteria in this disease historically. But I think most importantly is the very strong inventive step of Alex Sinclair, who has linked GLP-1 very strongly to lowering pressure in these patients. That's the first time that was shown by her clinically, and that I think bodes well for why we anticipate having a reasonable shot on goal here, but also probably explains why previous drugs would either failed or were just simply not hitting the right receptor to lower pressure.
Another one. So does repurposing an existing drug as opposed to developing a new one shorten the commercialization timeframe?
It does measurably by virtue of the fact that we can leverage particularly the safety and toxicity data of the reference drug Exenatide, which is currently sold in 2 formulations, Byetta and Bydureon. So we can take that package of information. We can also take the package of information from Peptron and their work. And so what it means is that we bypass a lot of those traditional drug development steps, not least of which is a $3 to $5 million preclinical spend to prove the drug doesn't cause any onerous effects in animals and particular animal models, but also we have bypassed a lot of the phase 1 human safety work, pharmacokinetic data, dosing regimens, because of that relationship with Peptron. So it really saves us, I think, overall between sort of 3 to 4 years, possibly. Noting, of course, we are also not required to run 2 trials. We are required to run one. It's a bit of a tongue twister, sorry.
A few more popping up. So approximately how long do CTAs take to be reviewed and processed?
It depends on the jurisdiction. So the FDA is pretty clear cut. I'll start with that one. So an IND filing, an investigational new drug filing, is 30 days. The FDA will either stop the clock and tell you need to do certain things, or if they say nothing, you're essentially clear to commence a study. In Europe, through the EMA, European Medicines Agency, and the MHRA in the United Kingdom, that can vary, but the timeline, give or take, is around sort of 60 to 80 days for each of those. In Australia, you typically go through a human ethics committee review first, and that's done at the hospital level. We filed an HREC in late December 2021. We're still waiting to hear back from that ethics committee. Once we hear back, which we expect this half, we'll be able to essentially start to enrol patients because we've accredited several sites in Australia already.
Well, just on that then, the next question is, so if Australia's CTA is successful, will the recruitment process for Australia commence immediately, or will the company wait until other CTAs have been filed and approved?
That's a good question. So think of it like a rolling process. As the CTAs are filed and then approved, we can then legally start to recruit patients. So we would anticipate, for no other reason than the fact it was the first filing, that it's likely that the first patient will come from Australia. And as I mentioned, that the other 3 filings in Europe, the United Kingdom, and the US will be progressively made this half. And as I mentioned, we expect to have that patient in late first half this calendar year.
And just a final one that's popped up. So is the company still in discussions with the FDA?
We've completed our process with the FDA. Let me qualify that. As it relates to the trial design and the requirements that the FDA imputed onto Invex, that completed in 2021. And the results of that are we are not pursuing a registration strategy in the United States currently, but we are enrolling US sites. Our engagement with the FDA right now is clearly the completion of the IND filing. And so the outcome of that filing, as I mentioned, is 30 days, give or take. That's our level of interaction with the FDA. But there'll be absolutely a lot of dialogue in the event that we are able to show a strong statistical and clinical efficacy result from our phase 3 trial. It's not out of the realms of possibility the FDA would consider changing their view, I guess, on how they think about Presendin's registration. But at this juncture, we will be educating and liaising with them once we've banked our phase 3, but noting the IND process in between.
Wonderful, Tom. That's all we've actually got time for today. There are quite a few questions coming through, so I would encourage you to reach out to Tom directly via the contact details on the bottom of their ASX releases. But Tom, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, everyone.